You're probably here because you're interested in the subject matter that we're going to be thinking about. And that subject is depression. Either you yourself have maybe experienced it, or you know a loved one who has had depression, and you're maybe wanting some guidance as to just what the nature of the illness is and how best you can cope with it. What I will say at the beginning is that if you've come here this evening to get all the answers, I don't have all the answers, but I do have hopefully guidelines that will help you. And what I want to say to you this evening is not something that merely comes out of a textbook. I suffered from depression, and I'll say a wee bit about that in a minute, back from about 1990. And I have studied the subject more or less since then, with the various developments in it and the attitudes towards it over the past nearly 30 years. I don't come from a Christian background. My mother was brought up Roman Catholic, my father a Protestant. Back in the 50s in Belfast, that wasn't an issue. Of course, when the Troubles came in the 60s, that did bring problems. Whenever my mum married my dad, neither of them really had any church connection. My mother no longer went to the chapel. My father, he never went to church at all. So we weren't really brought up as a family to go to church. But my paternal grandmother was a fine Christian lady, and from a relatively early age she took me along to her local Presbyterian church and their Sunday school. And eventually I went into the Boys Brigade, and I went there mainly because I was football mad and I wanted to play in the football team. And they had a rule in their company section that if you didn't go to the Sunday school and the BB Bible class, then it didn't matter if you were the best footballer in the world, you wouldn't get playing for the football team on a Saturday. And so I went along to the Bible class and the Sunday school, and it was all with a view to going to play for the football team. One Thursday night I came home from the Boys Brigade, and my mother told me that there had been a girl at the house looking for me. Now, I was 16 at the time, and to tell you the truth, I wasn't interested in the slightest in girls at 16. All I was interested in was football. But this girl had called, and it was a girl I knew from primary school. We had a bit of an affection for each other at one stage. Her father had taken a heart attack coming home from his holidays, and she wanted somebody to talk to. So I got in touch with her, we met up. She was a Christian, and she says, "Look, I'm not trying to date you, I just want somebody to chat with." I said, "That's fine." And I went along with her to her church. And the reason I went along was because I really liked her and I wanted to get into her good books. As it turned out, the man who was preaching in her church on one of the evenings that I went along with her was preaching from a passage from the Gospel of Matthew. And it was a passage that spoke about Jesus coming again at the end of the world and separating people into two groups: those who are the sheep and those who are the goats. In other words, those who are people who are saved and those who are people who are not. And what the minister said that night really, really spoke to me. And that night I became a Christian. And my grandmother was delighted. My father was very sceptical. At that stage I drunk quite a lot and smoked and gambled. The one thing I didn't do was run about with girls. And he said to me, "Oh, it'll only last a week or two," he says, "and before you know it, you'll be back down with us at the club," and so on. Well, that wasn't the case, actually. Because not long after being converted, I felt very, very strongly that God was calling me to be a minister of the gospel. And so I set out on a programme of study. I studied 1 year at the local technical college to get 2 A-levels in order to get into a theological college, the Theological College of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. For the next 3 years I studied in the Theological College, and we were in college most mornings 9 o'clock through to 3:30, 4. You were coming home and doing your homework, your assignments. I was a milkman, delivering milk around the streets in Belfast. That was the job I had. I was married, I had 1 child at that time. I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning doing the milk run, finishing about maybe 8 o'clock, into college for 9, studying until 4:30, coming home doing your assignments. At the weekends I was preaching every weekend, because back then students were allowed to preach as much as they wanted. And that went on for 4 years. 3 years at college, 1 year prior to that. In 1990, I was called to a church in County Down, and in September of that year I was ordained as a minister, and I was installed in the congregation of Dromara. It was the second largest congregation in our denomination, and within the first 3 or 4 months I had been round the whole congregation visiting them. I think I'd been round them nearly twice. That, together with preaching every Lord's Day, Bible studies during the week, all the things that ministers have to do, it was quite busy, to say the least. That Christmas, we lived in quite a big church house, a manse. In fact, far bigger than we could ever have dreamt of living in. The house that we lived in Belfast was a 2 up, 2 down, and very small. This house that we had moved into had 5 bedrooms and 3 reception rooms, and it was just like a mansion to us. So we decided we'd invite the wife's family down for Christmas, and they came down for Christmas. We had a lovely, lovely time. They stayed over Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, and on Boxing evening they went home. Whenever they left on Boxing evening, I went up the stairs and I lay down in the bed and I cried my eyes out. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I was just weeping. My wife came up and she said, "Look, it's probably you're exhausted, you probably need a week off." And as it happened, because it was Christmas, I had taken a week's holiday. She says, "A couple of days you'll be feeling grand." Well, a couple of days later I wasn't feeling grand. A couple of days later I was actually worse. And at the end of the week's holiday I had to get in touch with the doctor, and he went through all the symptoms and he diagnosed me as having depression. He gave me a couple of weeks off, and after a couple of weeks I went back to see him and the condition was worse. I was losing weight rapidly. In fact, I lost over 2.5 stone in the course of a very short period of time. I had become very, very emotional. I couldn't look at anybody without weeping. I was withdrawn. I wouldn't answer the door at the house. I sat in the house all day, and if the doorbell rang, I ran up the stairs and hid myself in the upstairs bathroom, grabbed myself in the fetal position, hoping that the person, whoever had rung the door, would go away. I had panic attacks, and that was a massive contrast to what was normal for me. Normally I'm a very outgoing person, very sociable, love a bit of crack, would talk to anybody. Getting a tear out of my eye would have been like trying to get blood out of a stone. I wasn't in any way someone who was emotional. But all that changed. The doctor gave me more time off, and to cut this part of the story short, after about 3 months or so of this ongoing condition and my medical health deteriorating each month, I decided that I would resign from the ministry. I felt that the responsibilities and the duties of the ministry were just far too demanding, and that was part of what was at the source of why I was depressed. I felt a complete failure. I felt I had failed my wife and my family. I brought them away from Belfast out into the country, and now with me resigning we had no home to go to. We had sold our house in Belfast, and the few pound that we did make on it, we had bought furniture for this massive big house because our furniture would have fitted in one room. I felt I'd failed the church. They called me to be their minister, and within a matter of 7-8 months I was resigning. I felt I'd let them down. I felt I'd let the denomination down. And I tried twice during that period to commit suicide, which I'm thankful to God for the fact that I didn't succeed. If you had have taken me aside then and spoken to me, I would have told you that I was thinking rationally, that I had thought through the thing, and that in my mind the best thing for everybody was for me to do myself in, basically. My wife would be sad, but she'd get over it. And there would be insurance money. I had worked out how I could commit suicide so that it wouldn't be seen to be suicide and so that she would get the insurance money. The church, well, they would lose their minister, but ministers come and ministers go, and I would just be a statistic in their history. Reverend Rob, minister from this state to this state, and that was it, and I'd get somebody else, and before long I'd be forgotten. As I say, thank God, I didn't succeed. I left the ministry and returned to Belfast and got a job eventually in secular employment, determined that I would never ever go into the ministry again and never ever stand up before any group of people and speak. The thought of me standing before anybody and speaking back in 1990 was just absolutely horrifying to me. But God had other plans. And 5 years later, in 1995, after I had physically recovered and mentally recovered, the congregation of Limavady in County Derry contacted me and asked if I would consider becoming their minister. I panicked at the thought of it, talked to my wife, and my wife said, if by the end of the period of time that we've been given, me and the children's attitude has changed, because she was totally against it, knowing what had happened before. She says, if our attitudes have changed and we feel that this is God calling us, then we know we have to go back. And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. My wife and the kids wanted to go to Limavady. I didn't particularly, but I knew that this was what God wanted. And we went. We had 14 wonderful years there. Really, really enjoyed our ministry. I still suffered from depression from time to time. I was put on medication in 1990. This is 2017, so what's that? 27 years. And I'm still on medication. I take antidepressants every day. And I'll say a wee bit about that later. And what I'm trying to say to you is, what I'm going to say about depression this evening is based upon personal experience and also upon scientific and medical research of which I've read over the past nearly 30 years. So I hope that what I say will help you. And I'm going to leave a bit of time at the end for you to ask questions. I'm not guaranteeing I'm going to give you answers to them all, but I'll do my best. What can we say about depression? Well, depression is the number one psychological disorder in the Western world at the minute. And it is growing rapidly, and it is growing in all age groups. It's hard to believe that they're actually diagnosing children now. Children under 10 with depression. They reckon that in 3 years' time, by 2020, this will be the second most debilitating medical condition in the world. Second only to heart disease. When I first prepared this talk a number of years ago, there were 300,000 people in Ireland who were diagnosed as suffering from depression. That's not counting the ones that hadn't been to the doctor. I looked it up today, and there are over 400,000 now. Over 100,000 more in just a few years. It's something that affects all age groups. It affects all social status. People who are managers and chief executive officers, right down to people who are unemployed. It affects all nationalities. It's not something that's just confined to the Irish or the Welsh or the Scots. It affects the Chinese, the Australians, Americans. It has increased more than 12-fold since 1945. And it'll not surprise you to learn that the most frequently prescribed drugs that are given out by GPs is antidepressants. And it costs many, many millions of pounds and euros every year for antidepressants. I don't know what the figure is here in Ireland, but certainly in Britain, going back 8 years ago, it cost the British government £276 million for antidepressants alone in 2009. That's 8 years ago, like. Depression, and I want you to listen to this and hold on to it. Depression is usually a symptom or a reaction to a deeper problem. Okay? Depression is usually a reaction or a symptom of a deeper problem. You'll also understand too that it's a major cause of suicide. and it is more common in men than it is in women. 80% of all suicides are depression related. There's also a very clear link that has been established between alcohol intake and depression. And you can see how that is. People who are depressed take drink to try and get away from their depression. And what they don't maybe understand is that alcohol is not a stimulant. Alcohol is a depressant. And so whilst it'll give you a high for a wee while, you'll come off and you'll feel even worse. So what is depression? What is depression? Well, we all have days whenever we feel down, whenever we feel gloomy, sad, bored, wiped out. And we may say to ourselves, I felt a bit depressed today. I would suggest that discouraged is a better term for that. It's certainly not depression. If you're expecting to live in this world without occasionally being gloomy, disenchanted, discouraged, feeling down, then you're being totally unrealistic. There are going to be days like that. There are going to be days when you're sad and discouraged and fed up. But it would be wrong to think that at those times you're suffering from depression. Depression's not that. It's much, much more than that. Let me give you a definition of depression. This is my own definition that I've put together from different sources. Depression is an ongoing, perpetual, debilitating mood where the person is overcome with feelings of emptiness, inadequacy, worthlessness, despair, and hopelessness that causes life to seem utterly pointless, joyless, and a burden, with the result that that person stops being able to properly cope with and handle daily life and its responsibilities. That's depression. It's getting to the stage where it goes on day after day. You're feeling totally inadequate, worthless, you're despairing, you feel hopeless, everything seems pointless, you've no joy in life, you're burdened, and as a result of that, you can't do the normal things that you used to be able to do. So what are, should I say, some of the symptoms of depression? If you were to go to your doctor, and your doctor is going to diagnose you as having depression, what are the sort of things that a GP would be looking for? Well, there's many different symptoms associated with depression, and whilst you might suffer from time to time from one or some of these things, that doesn't necessarily mean you're depressed. But if several of these things are true of a person, and they're present in their experience for a reasonably prolonged period of time, say maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks, and that state represents a real change from what they were previously like, then in all probability the doctor will diagnose you as being depressed. So what are some of these things that are symptoms of depression? Well, first of all, a profound feeling of lethargy. What I mean by that is that you lose interest in doing things. Things that you used to do and enjoy, you don't enjoy them anymore, you don't even want to do them. If you enjoyed going out for walks, don't want to go. If you enjoyed reading, don't read. Even TV, don't enjoy that anymore. A profound feeling of lethargy. Secondly, in some people it manifests itself in a lack of energy. You know, you go to bed and sleep for 12 hours and get up and still feel knackered. And no matter what you do, after you do, no energy at all. And you just feel like sitting down all the time and you don't want to get up and do anything. Thirdly, broken sleep patterns. Some people are really, really tired and they go to bed and they can't get to sleep. Now, we're all like that at some time. But for people who are experiencing depression, this can be a prolonged thing. You're knackered and you go to bed, but you can't get over. And you turn on this side, and you turn to that side, and you turn the pillow over to get the cold bit, and you lie on your back, and you still can't get over. And then you're annoyed because the one lying beside you is snoring their head off, whether it's your wife or your husband or whoever. Or, alternatively, you go to bed, and you're out like a light, but within 2 hours you're awake again. And then you can't get over. And so, your sleep pattern is broken. And you're not getting the rest at night that you would normally get. Another symptom, unable to concentrate on things. I love reading. During the time I was depressed, I couldn't read anything hardly. I picked up a book and read a page, and then looked at it and thought, well, I haven't read that page, I don't even know what it said. And you read it again and again, and it still doesn't go in. Or you're watching TV, but you're not really watching it. It's on, but there's nothing on in here. You're just looking at a screen, and you're not really concentrating. You can't concentrate on hardly anything. In some people, depression manifests itself in an increased irritability. Some men and some women are irritable by nature, but whenever depression comes, it can actually heighten that irritability. That no matter what somebody does, you're very quick to come down on them. Certainly a heightened state of anxiety, where you have panic attacks. As I explained earlier, as I described earlier, when the doorbell rang, I just went into a panic and ran up the stairs and hid. Totally irrational. But that's what happens. A sense of hopelessness and despair, a low sense of self-esteem. You begin to think that, you're a failure, you're rubbish. Weight loss for some people. Say I lost 2.5 stone very quickly. It's certainly a way to diet, but I wouldn't recommend it. Other people don't lose weight, they put weight on. Because they're depressed, they keep going to the fridge. And by 10:30, they've already gone through 3 Mars bars and 3 packets of cheese and onion crisps. So they put weight on, they comfort eat. Not wanting to go out. I'm a very outgoing, sociable person. That time in my life, I wouldn't go out the door. I didn't want to see anybody. Not wanting to meet people. You isolate yourself. Easily moved to tears. Before I had this experience, I wouldn't have been moved to tears easily. At that time, and even beyond it, even now, I can get emotional very, very quickly. Suicidal thoughts. I've explained that. And a deep sense of guilt. I'm letting people down because I'm like this. It's all my fault. And if you or someone you know goes to the doctor and you say that this is how you're feeling and there's several of these symptoms present, your doctor will more than likely say you're suffering from depression. These are the symptoms. But then we ask the question, what are the causes? And this is the big question. Because the causes of depression can be very complex. And one of the reasons for that is because there is not a one-size-fits-all reason as to why you get depressed or somebody else gets depressed. It's easy to diagnose, for example, appendicitis. We all get appendicitis the same way. If you get an inflamed appendicitis, you go to the doctor, and whether it's you or me, it's the same thing. Well, it's not the same with depression. Depression basically falls into 2 categories. There's what can be called biological depression. And then there's what is known as social, or I would also add spiritual depression. Let's look at the biological reasons. A lot of research has gone into depression in recent years, not surprisingly considering how much it costs governments to deal with it. And as a result of that, experts have come up with various things that they feel are biological factors that can cause depression. First of all, there are bacterial and viral causes. What I didn't say earlier on was that when I was 10 years old, I was taken into hospital on a medical emergency and diagnosed as having bacterial meningitis, which, as you know, is a very, very serious condition. I was taken to what was then the Fever Hospital in Belfast. Each unit was isolated in that it was completely closed in glass. The guy next to me, he was completely closed in glass. It was an infectious disease place. You weren't allowed into it without all the gear on you. The guy who came in the same day as me in the next bed in the next unit, he died that night. So you can imagine how my parents were feeling. Thankfully, as you can see, I came through that. At the age of 26, I took meningitis again. Only this time it was the B strain of it, not the severe strain. Or it wasn't the bacterial, it was the other strain of it. I was only in hospital that time for about 8 or 9 days. Now, I have talked with doctors and researchers, and some of them believe that as a result of having contracted that particular disease, and it can apply to other diseases, the bacteria that was in my body affected the functioning of my body, particularly the functioning of the brain. And as a result, my brain no longer produces as much of the chemical that's needed to keep me in emotional equilibrium, emotional stability. It's called serotonin. And if my body isn't producing that, then I'm going to be out of sync emotionally. And they reckon that that's one of the after effects of having something like meningitis, or a bacterial or a viral infection. Right? So that can cause depression, they reckon. Another factor can be a brain disorder. If you're in a car crash, for example, and your brain gets damaged, or if you're horse riding and you fall and your brain gets damaged, or if you're playing football or Gaelic and your head gets hit and you get damaged, that can cause neurochemical malfunctioning in your brain, and again an imbalance in the chemical makeup of your body, thus resulting in you not having in your body enough serotonin to keep you emotionally balanced. Another cause is post-surgery causes. You've maybe known people who have gone into the hospital for a routine operation and they've been fine. And they've gone through their operation, and a day after it, they're dead on, but then suddenly they're out of sorts, and before you know it, they're depressed, and suddenly they're in this spiral of depression. And some experts believe that sometimes what happens is that in the course of the operation, things happen that cause the chemical makeup in the body to change as a result of surgery. And that then can lead biologically to depression. The same can be said for glandular disorders, hormonal imbalances, and this is particularly true of women. For example, some women at the time of the month, whenever they're having their period, they will feel really, really down. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a hormonal change within. So it's biological. And then there's been a lot of study recently into whether or not depression has any hereditary genetic factor. And they're increasingly coming to the point where they're saying, yes, there is. So in other words, my children will not thank me for this, but because I have had depression, there is a much greater likelihood that my children will have depression. Now, as I say, there's no 100%, guarantee that that's the case, but they are moving to saying this is likely the case. And it's interesting that one of my children actually does take medication for a similar problem. Another thing that contributes to biological depression is a lack of sleep, a lack of exercise, and a lack of light. Some of you will have heard of the condition SAD, Seasonal Affective Disorder. And it happens during the winter months, whenever the sun is away from us more, although in Ireland we don't get much sun, but you know what I mean. In the spring and in the summer, the sun's rays come into our bodies, and we take that in, and that has a chemical reaction in our body. And in the winter months there's not as much sun about, and that affects some people and causes them, because they don't have the chemicals, to then become depressed. And some people buy these light boxes that they sit in front of that gives the impression of sun's rays. Lack of sleep and lack of exercise. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, the Bible says. And what that means is that God has made us in such a way that if we lose sleep, that will affect us. Now, how many of us have known, you've gone to bed, you haven't had a good night's sleep, and you get up the next day and you feel absolutely wick? And if that goes on for a day or two, you know what it's like. You're getting up and you're feeling grumpy and you're feeling out of sorts, and the slightest thing sets you off and you can be emotionally drained. Well, if that's happening on a regular basis each night, you can see how that's going to affect you. And similarly with exercise, and even with diet. I'll maybe say something about that later. So that's one cause, biological. But then there's another cause, and that is social factors, or relational factors, or spiritual factors. Some people are depressed because of things that are going on in their life. It's not biological. Depressed maybe because their relationship with their wife or their husband isn't what it should be. Not what they thought it would be. They've got to a stage in life where all the romance is gone and things are just blah, and maybe even they're getting at each other's throats, and marriage is just wick. And some people can get depressed as a result of that and get down. Or it can be relationships between parents and children, or whatever. Some people get depressed as a result of stress, and very often stress that is associated with work. We live in days where employers are wanting more production for less money, and the demands of the market are great, and an awful lot of people are stressed out because of the demands that they have at work. And maybe farmers and the demands of the farm, and prices are falling, and they have to feed the cattle, they have to do this and do that, and it's getting so hard, and they owe the bank this amount of money, and they're wondering where their next penny's coming from, how they're going to pay for, the telephone, the electric, the food for the kids, the mortgage. And as a result of that, people get depressed. It's got nothing to do with biological factors, it's other factors. With some people, it's as a result of loneliness, and particularly bereavement. In a normal course of affairs, whenever one experiences a bereavement, you expect them to be down. That's normal. They weep, they're sad, of course they are. But most people come to manage that after a period of time. For some people it'll be after a few weeks, for some it'll be after a few months, for some it'll take longer. But they manage it. The pain never goes away, but they know how to manage it. But there's others who, as a result of the bereavement, never get through that grieving period, and that actually gets worse, and they become isolated and depressed and won't go out. And it's a direct result of how they have reacted to the bereavement they've experienced, or to the loneliness that they experience. A mother, for example, sitting at home, 2 or 3 children. One of them lives north, one of them lives south, one of them lives over in the mainland or in America, and they never call to see her, and she's there on her own, and gets up in the morning, from first thing in the morning, last thing in the night, there's nobody comes. And she can get depressed. Or a father. Depression as a result of abuse. There's been a lot of study into this recently, and particularly with the awful sexual abuse that there has been within the church. I spoke about this in Dublin, and a man came to me afterwards to say that he had been sexually abused by his priest, and the priest is now in jail. And he spoke about how that had affected him all through the years, and it put him into a spiral of depression because he had this behind him and he thought that it was his fault. Depression as a result of guilt. Up north we had the Troubles, of course it affected down south as well. And there are people running about up north who have guilt on their conscience. They know they're responsible for the murder of that man, that woman, that soldier, that policeman, or whoever. And deep down, that's a factor with some of them as to why they're depressed. Other people, they're depressed because they've got the wrong priorities in life. They've set goals that they haven't been able to achieve, and because their sense of worth is built into what they achieve and how they stand in other people's eyes, the fact that they fail to do that causes them to be depressed. So the young person who doesn't get the A stars to get them to university depresses them. The young person who doesn't meet their parents' expectations that should never have been put on the young person, and the young person gets depressed. The man who's in a job and he wants to go for the higher position and he's working towards it and he gives everything to it and he doesn't get it. And it knocks him for six and he can become depressed. And then I've said alcohol and drug abuse as well can cause depression. I came across an interesting statistic. I'm going to have to go through this quickly. Only 5% of people who go and see a psychiatrist or a counsellor are proven to have any actual brain disorder. That was a survey done in America of people who were depressed, and they discovered that only 5% of them could link the depression to biological reasons. Now that's going to be important, as you'll see in a minute. In other words, whereas 75% who attended a counsellor, a psychiatrist, or whatever, 75%, the root cause of their problem was in relationships, stress, unrealised expectations, and those other things that we mentioned, loneliness, bereavement, or whatever. Now, in relation to non-biological causes for depression, non-physiological reasons, I want to go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I said depression is usually a reaction or a response to something else. And what I mean by that is, depression isn't the problem itself for most people. The problem is usually something else, and depression is the symptom of that something else. So if you're going to deal with depression, you have to get at the root cause of it. If you're taking medication just to deal with the symptoms, and if the cause of the depression is not biological, then all the tablets in the world aren't going to fix that. For example, if I'm depressed because my relationship with my wife is absolutely wicked at the minute, and I go to the doctor and he says, "Oh, you're depressed, here's tablets." Well, giving me tablets isn't going to change my relationship to my wife. It may alleviate some of the symptoms. It might help me to sleep better if he gives me enough of them to knock me out at night. And I'll have to listen to her. But that's not going to change the problem. It might give me tablets that'll make me feel better. But that's not going to deal with the actual cause. And the other thing is that the way that one person responds to a particular set of circumstances is not necessarily the way another person responds to a particular set of circumstances. I don't know whether any of you know of a Christian lady called Joni Eareckson Tada. She's an American girl. Well, she's an American woman now. When she was 17, I think it was, she went for a swim and she dived into what she thought was deep water. Turned out that where she dived wasn't deep at all, it was shallow, and she hit her head and she became paraplegic. She was in hospital. From there down, completely paralysed. In the first few days in the hospital, she was really, really angry at God, and her faith was really, really tested. And then she came to the point of realising there's not one thing I can do about my circumstances. I can't change my circumstances, but what I can do is I can change the way in which I look at my circumstances and respond to my circumstances. I can go on being angry, I can go on being depressed, I can go on shouting at God and blaming Him. And if I do that, the rest of my life's going to be miserable. Or I can accept that this has happened, and I can look to God for help and for strength and keep my faith. Now, she did the latter. And as it turned out, God has wonderfully used her. She's travelled all over the world in her wheelchair. She learned how to paint using just her mouth and her teeth. She has written several books. She's a conference speaker. God has wonderfully used that woman out of what was a tragedy. But she responded to her circumstances in a God-honouring way rather than a way that was God-dishonouring, which is interesting. People react differently. Their worldview, their faith, causes them to look at their circumstances and, where possible, to try and deal with the circumstances in a way that honours God, bring about change, and if change isn't possible, to accept things as they are and, with God's help, to make the best of what is. Because if you keep on feeling down and depressed, the rest of life is going to be totally miserable. One of the things I discovered when I was depressed was that it's not like the broken arm or the broken leg where people can actually see evidence of a real injury. And the more depressed I became and the longer it went on, the harder I found it was going to be to get better. Think about it. If I went to bed one night after being depressed for 3 months and get up the next morning and thought, well, things aren't really too bad. I've got a wife, I've got kids, I've got a job, I've got such and such. And I get up and said, I'm better, I feel great now. People are going to say, what was all that about then? So there's a fear of being better. And you nearly begin to identify yourself as the person who's depressed. I'm Robert Robb, the minister who has depression. Take away who has depression, and who am I now? You nearly identify with the illness. And if you take away the illness, there's the danger that you lose who you are. And I would say to anybody who knows anybody who's depressed, or if you're depressed yourself, don't be afraid of getting better, and don't worry what anybody else says. They'll say, well, you were depressed yesterday, why are you feeling better today? Feelings are an amazing thing. We should never do merely what our feelings say. If you do only what your feelings say, you'll never do anything. Like, for example, people would come to me and say, do you feel like going out for a cup of coffee? And if you're depressed, the last thing you want to do is go out and have a cup of coffee with people around you. That's how you feel. But I'm thankful that people came to me and says, right, I know how you feel, but you're coming out for a cup of coffee, and I'd come and just get me and take me. And whenever you went out, you actually enjoyed it. And it was beneficial. I don't feel like washing the dishes. I don't care how you feel. Go and wash the dishes. And then once you wash the dishes, you'll actually feel that you've achieved something, and that will be a positive in your life rather than a negative, and that will be a step up the spiral rather than a step further down the spiral. It's interesting if you go to people's homes where there's been a prolonged period of depression, hardly any housework done. Places dusty, ironing's lying about, dishes are lying about, because they don't feel like doing them. We have to act apart from our feelings. Depression often stems from a downward cycle where we have a problem, we react to it in a way that is wrong, and because we've reacted that way, we feel bad about it, and that puts us on a downward spiral, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And the way to come out of that is to have positive things to bring you up again. Depression, like every illness and sickness that's in this world, it can be explained biologically, it can be explained relationally, but there's a spiritual aspect to it, folks. This world that we live in isn't the way God made the world. Whenever God made the world, He made it perfect. There was no sickness, there was no illness, there was no death. But whenever sin came into the world, it affected every aspect of life. It affected our relationship with God, it affected our relationship with each other. It brought death, it brought sickness. All of those things are part and parcel of the world that we live in today. And you could say that if there was no sin, then there would be no depression. Because depression ultimately is a result of sin being in our world. In the same way as you could say, if there was no sin, there wouldn't be any heart disease. If there was no sin, there wouldn't be any motor neuron disease. All these things came in as a result of sin that corrupted God's world. And many people, I'm convinced, and I've spoken all over Ireland on this subject, and I've counselled people north, south, east and west, I'm convinced that many people are suffering depression because of the impact of their own circumstances in which there are sinful things going on that cause them to feel miserable. So you go back, for example, to the illustration I've used throughout the night, the husband and the wife, things aren't the way they should be. And because things aren't the way they should be, one or the other or both of them are feeling depressed. What's the problem there? The problem is they're not living together as husband and wife the way they should be according to the Maker's plan. God has a blueprint for marriage. If you follow it, your marriage will be the way God intended it to be. And the more you move away from it, the worse your relationship's going to be. And the worse your relationship's going to be, the more it's going to affect you. Emotionally, psychologically, mentally, and so on. I said earlier that only 5% of those tested and who go and see a counsellor for depression can prove that it's biological. And that means that the vast majority of people who are depressed is caused by something other than biological factors. And giving such people tablets will not cure the problem. Now, having said that, if you have a biological reason for your depression, you will need tablets. That's why I take tablets. And you should never be stigmatised by that. All a tablet is doing is giving to your body the chemical that your body isn't producing. And what can happen is, because you're in a bad relationship, because you're stressed at work, because things are getting on top of you on the farm, your body can then begin to close down in certain areas where it gets to the stage where that serotonin isn't being produced. So even though the factors that are causing it initially begin in relationships or in problems, that can actually produce a biological factor then. And so you may well need medication to get you stabilised enough where you then deal with the problem itself. You understand what I mean? So in other words, bad relationship between husband and wife causes them both to become depressed, and in their state of depression, their body is actually, because of all the hassle and because of the stress of that relationship, it's not producing what it should produce. They get the medication of the doctor. That then will help to bring their levels of serotonin up, to bring them the emotional balance, but the problem is still there. So then they're in a position where they're more stable and they're better able then to address the problem. Whatever that problem happens to be. I'm just using the marriage relationship one. What's the answer to all of these things? Well, let me suggest something really radical. The answer to many people's depression problems, in fact I would go so far as to say everybody's depression problems, is to be found in the gospel. And you say, well, how do you get from talking about depression to get into the gospel? Well, the reason, as I said, why our relationships in life are not what they should be, the reason why people are aspiring to fulfillment in things other than God, first and foremost, is because of sin. And if you don't deal with that problem, then the symptom won't go away. People are living their lives in a way today that are so far removed from the way that God intended them to live their lives that they're suffering all kinds of repercussions because of what they're doing. And depression is one of those repercussions. Let me try and show you that from the Bible. I don't know how familiar you folks are with the Bible, but David was the king of Israel. And as king of Israel, he could have what he wanted. And he sent his army out to fight a battle. And instead of going and leading his army, he decided to stay at home. And one night while he was staying at home, he was up on his rooftop. And the roofs in Palestine, by the way, are flat. It's not that he was on a roof like this, clinging on, it's a flat roof. So he's standing on a flat roof and he looks out into his neighbour's garden. And there's his neighbour's wife, Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was a stunner. And she was bathing naked. And David seen her and he thought, I would quite like that. And so he got a servant and he said to his servant, who's that living next to you? He says, that's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. He says, away over and tell her that the king wants to have a wee word with her. So they sent for Bathsheba, and Bathsheba came over, and you can guess what happened. David commits adultery with Bathsheba. And Bathsheba goes home, and that's the end of it. So David thought. A few weeks later, David, what is it, Bathsheba? I'm pregnant. Uh-oh. Because Bathsheba's husband is in the army fighting for David, and he'll realise this child isn't his. How could it be his? He's been away fighting. Hasn't been there with his wife. So David thinks up a great plan. He sends for Uriah, who's in the battle, and he gets the commander to send him home, supposedly to bring news of the battle. And Uriah comes back and he tells David how the battle's going, and David says, oh, that's great. Well, you're here, you might as well go and spend the night with your wife. I mean, it's been months since you've been, you might as well go home. But Uriah, you see, is more righteous than David, and Uriah says, no, I'm not going to lie with my wife whenever all my mates are out fighting in the battle. He says, that wouldn't be right. So David's plan is scuppered. He thought, I'll get Uriah to go down, sleep with Bathsheba. There's only a couple of weeks of difference. He'll not know, and he'll think it's his child. So the next day, David says, well, look, stay for another day. And that night he gets Uriah drunk. And he thinks, Uriah will definitely go down now. He's had a few, he'll definitely want to go down and stay with his wife. But he didn't. He slept at David's gate. So David then decided, right, I'll have to do something about this. So he sent him back to the battle with a note for the commander. And the note for the commander said, put Uriah at the fiercest place where the battle is being fought. In other words, make sure this man's killed. He put a contract out on him, basically. He said, Joab, I want you to make sure this man's put to death. And that's exactly what happened. And word comes back that Uriah is dead, and David goes, oh dear, that's awful, sad. And Bathsheba, she weeps and cries for a few weeks, and then she comes to David, and David takes her as his wife. Now, I'm going to read to you from Psalm 32. And this psalm was written by David after he had been confronted with his sin. Okay? For a year, he pretended everything was all right, nothing had happened. And at the end of that year, one of God's prophets came to him, and he challenged David. And basically he confronted him with his sin. Here's David describing how he felt during that year when he was covering up his guilt and not dealing with his guilt and his sin. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. Day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. In another psalm written at the same time, he says this, Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. Your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. There's no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There's no health in my bones because of my sin. Iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate all the day long. I go about with mourning. My sides are filled with burning. There's no soundness in my flesh. I feel feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult in my heart. In other words, here's a man who is utterly depressed. And why was he depressed? He was depressed because he had done something wrong. He wasn't willing to face up to it and deal with it and come before God and repent of it. And all the while that was there, David was depressed. Now, he could have gone to the local doctor and says, give us some tablets. That wasn't going to deal with David's problem. David's problem was he needed to get this sorted out. And he did get it sorted out. Listen to what he says in Psalm 32. Day and night your hand was heavy on me, my strength was dried up as heat in the summer. But then he says this, I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Blessed, or how happy, is the man whose transgression has been forgiven and whose sin is covered. So in other words, when he dealt with the problem, and he dealt with it biblically, he experienced blessedness. And I think that many people today are a bit like David. They've got things going on in their life that they haven't been willing to deal with biblically. And most of all, the relationship that is most fundamental in life, the relationship with God, is not what it should be. And because that's not what it should be, that is a big contributing factor to how they feel in themselves. And if that relationship was sorted out, and if they were to go to the Maker's handbook of life and how life should be lived, there it is. Their life would be much more satisfying, joyful than it is now. It's a bit like going to IKEA or somewhere like that and getting, one of those things that you put up and throwing away the instruction booklet and say, I know how to do it. And of course us men know how to do these things, and you end up with bits here and bits there and there's bits left over. You haven't followed the instructions. Of course you're going to get it wrong. And there's repercussions and consequences. So, what was my anchor in the midst of that depression? Like Joni Eareckson, there was a period where I was angry with God when I thought, I'm going to end it. But there came that point where you realise this isn't right. If this is going to be sorted out, I need to make sure my relationship with God more than anything else is right. And if that's right, everything else will fall into place. And that's where I threw my anchor. My relationship with my God. And although it was hard, I was out of work, we didn't have a house to live in, God provided wonderfully. And He used that period in my life to teach me an awful lot about me and to change me. And He has used that experience many years later now, enabling me to come alongside people and to give them a wee bit of help in relation to this subject. Because I can speak from experience and not just from a textbook. And folks, if you know somebody who's depressed, or if you're depressed yourself, the one thing you need to do is you need to say to yourself, look, is this because there's something going on in my life that I need to get sorted out? Identifying the root cause. And once you do that, then you're on the right path to dealing with it. And not only dealing with it, but overcoming it. Anybody who has depression, I don't think ever gets fully over it, because I do think it affects the brain and there is an imbalance and you need medication. Most people do. But it can be wonderfully managed. I mean, the number of days that I'm down in a year now is maybe 1 out of 365 as opposed to a lot more back in 1990. There's a lot more I could say about how to help people, but maybe it's a good point now just to stop and to ask if any of you have any questions. If you have any questions about anything I've said, or some things that I maybe didn't mention, don't be afraid to ask. I'm going to be knocking about here afterwards. If you want to come up privately and talk to me, you can do that.